This is Alexander Lim, and welcome to AuthorStory, our featured book for this episode, which you can check out by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below, is Of Grief, Garlic, and Gratitude, Returning to Hope and Joy from a Shattered Life, Sam's Love Story. The author, Kris Franceour, has a master's degree in counseling psychology and educational leadership, has published 3 romance novels under the pen name Annabelle Rose, and one of the things she enjoys doing in her free time is spinning alpaca wool from a herd of alpacas into knitting yarn. So, Kris, again, good morning and welcome to Author Story.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, Kris, first off, the book. Let's face it, grief is something that just about every one of us face at some point in their lives. The loss of someone or something very close to them. In your case, this is about your son, and the book is about the 30 months immediately after the death of your son. Is this not?
Yes.
All right. So what made you decide to write it? Not to be crass, but the truth is, everyone who deals with a lost loved one doesn't write a book, because usually it's too darn painful to talk about, much less write about.
Sure. Well, it started within days after Sam's death. I started recognizing how deep and seemingly overwhelming my grief was, the darkness of that grief.
Right.
I started posting online every day one or two or more things that I was thankful for on that day, things where for just a moment, the darkness of the grief lifted for just a bit.
Right.
And after a couple months of doing that regularly, people started talking to me both online and in person saying that my posts about gratitude were resonating with them and were helping them look at how they looked at their own lives. And people started saying, you are someone who writes often and frequently in different genres.
Right.
Why don't you think about putting this together into a book? And I didn't really think about it for about another 2 years, but then began to think about how many times I'd heard that and how much the practice of gratitude had helped me, and thought it might help somebody else.
Okay, all right. And of course, out of that came the book, and I'm sure it's helping a lot of folks right now.
Thank you.
All right. So, Kris, now about Sam, your son. What kind of person was he?
Sam was, from the moment he was born, Sam was a beacon of light and love. And we knew that as a family, but we didn't until after his death fully understand how much that was true, far beyond our family, far beyond our local community. He was the kid who, as a little boy, you had to hold his hand everywhere you went, because he would wander off to talk to complete strangers because he thought they were interesting.
All right. Okay.
And even as he went into his teens, late teens, early, and turned 20, right, as he struggled with bipolar disorder and struggled with substance abuse and addiction, he still was the person that he would walk through town and see someone sitting alone and would stop and see if they were okay, and sit and talk and listen to them. And he had an ability that I've never seen in anyone else to this extent, to see every person as worthy of love and as just being every person as a gift. And that was how he treated people. And even in his death, or with his death, suddenly we had people that we did not know from all over the globe that had met Sam in various places, right, coming to our house, calling us, showing up to tell us about stories of Sam.
Right. Okay. So, when would you know when or how he got hooked in opioids?
We know some of it. We have pieced together. We haven't pieced together everything. Okay. We know that at 14, he started smoking marijuana. Recreationally, but he had not at that point been identified as having bipolar disorder.
Okay.
But he did recognize, he said, later told us at about 16, he recognized that if he was smoking marijuana, the mood swings associated with the bipolar disorder, he was able to control them. As time went on, as teenagers often do, he and his friends started drinking along with the marijuana, and over time he, we know, had other people's prescription medications and basically sort of found anything he could when he could.
Right. And I find this interesting because from what I understand, you live in a rural part of Vermont. And when we talk about drugs, I mean, the most common thing that comes up is a stereotype, inner city, ghettos, or, some highfalutin, high-flying party with high rollers where they take in, lines of cocaine. How prevalent is the drug problem where you live?
Vermont has been absolutely destroyed by the opioid epidemic. While we are very rural, we are sort of equidistant with major highways between Montreal, New York City, and Boston. And drugs are coming through Vermont at an amazing rate. And I mean, to a point where Rolling Stone magazine did a cover story about the opioid epidemic in Vermont.
Wow, so it's a really big issue there. I mean, it's a really big and really serious issue. Wouldn't
Yes.
I mean, given the vulnerability of kids, I mean, they're the ones who are most likely to start trying this out. Wasn't there any discussion in the school or conversation in the school about the opioids, the drugs that are going through Vermont?
There have been endless conversations about it, but I think as has historically been true, teenagers don't necessarily listen to what adults say about these things.
Right. Okay. All right. So grief. I'd like to talk a little bit about the topic of grief. Like I said earlier, it's something we all experience, and it's, um, I mean, you can have all the degrees of psychology you want, but let's face it, nothing can prepare anyone for the kind of loss like what you suffered.
Absolutely. And it's not, we as a family had experienced grief before, but this grief it's not the natural order of things for parents to bury children. And I think especially, I think any parent who loses a child, the grief is incredibly profound. I would say, Sam was such a character and had such energy that when that energy suddenly, we thought, was gone, it just left this gaping hole.
Okay. And with reference to your majors, I mean, I imagine, given your background, that you may have a different view of grief from the average person. I mean, like the average person see grief as something horrific and painful, and move away from it. It's like a serious disease. But the truth is, grief is a process. It's not. I mean, it is. I mean, this is probably. I don't want to sound crass again, but this is a part of life, and there are stages in the process of everything that goes on in life.
Yes, very much so. And I think I went into, once we were past the first couple days, I kept going back to my training as a counselor and waiting for the Kubler-Ross stages of grief to come in the order in which I had learned them in grad school.
Okay.
And I kept waiting for this very seemingly logical process to the grief. And what I found over time was, and having talked now over the years to many other grieving parents, but also many psychiatrists and psychologists who focus on grief work, that grief of parents does follow, it does have stages to it.
Okay.
But it doesn't always have the same stages as we tend to have, say, if we lose a parent or a friend. I kept waiting to get to the stage of being angry. And that stage never really came. Doesn't mean it won't at some point in my life.
Right.
But that was the one when I looked at the stages of grief, I kept going, well, I've missed that one.
Okay. All right. So you did mention the stages. Are there any particulars? What are the particular stages in this process? Now, I understand that, as you mentioned, it doesn't occur the same way to everyone, but in general, what are these stages?
The stages generally go from the, the news and the shock and the numbness at the very beginning, moving through beginnings of acceptance, sadness, some anger, and eventually reaching a point of acceptance and some sense of peace. And I think, the shock we felt deeply.
Right.
The sadness we felt deeply and still continue to.
Right.
I don't think, speaking for my husband and myself, we never really hit an anger stage. And I think we, to the best of our ability, have moved to a point of acceptance, recognizing that we can't change it. And grief and missing Sam has sort of become, in some ways, like the callus, when you get a callus or something on your foot, that you just, you learn how to walk with it.
All right. So I mean, there's I'd like to address the issue because I mean there's a fantasy out there. There's I don't know how to call it other than a fantasy, a conversation out there that eventually everything will be okay and it's a happily ever after kind of thing. But this really isn't the case. I mean, you lose someone close, and you'll miss that person for the rest of your life. Is that not?
Absolutely. And that was something for me that was a very hard lesson to learn in this. At Sam's service of celebration of life, a woman I've known for probably 40 years, whose son also had died of an opioid overdose 15 years before Sam's death.
Right.
She came up, she gave me a hug, and I said to her, tell me it gets better. And I wanted somebody to tell me that this crushing pain was going to lighten and someday I was going to feel normal again.
Right.
And she stood there holding my hands on this beautiful fall Vermont day and said, it doesn't get better, it gets different. And I was so angry at her because I needed someone to tell me it was going to get better.
Right.
And she and I have talked about it many times since then. The kindest thing she could do in that moment was tell me the truth. And the truth was, it wasn't going to get better. It was going to get different. I will miss Sam until someday, and however the universe works, we are reunited. Having said that, I have learned to live with the grief.
Okay. All right. So it's kind of like not returning back to your previous normal kind of life, but assuming I know how to put this, a new normal, a new way of normality.
Absolutely.
All right. I got that. All right. So grief is painful, and as I mentioned, the average person, doesn't know how to deal with it. So it's surprising that when they're hit with grief, quite a few people learn to lean on such things as chemicals, drink, psychotherapy, stuff like that. Is there a way to deal with grief without resorting to such methods? Because I mean, let's face it, this sort of thing could become addictive.
For us, that was a real concern. We are not a religious family. We did not want to go down the prescription medication or illegal medication route, or the heavily drinking, those pieces. For us, as an extended family, we each had to learn how to deal with our grief in our own unique ways. But our consistent pieces were trying to be outside, be with nature as much as we could be. Really what we were trying to do is, as we put it as a family, we were trying to do a Sam. We were trying to hold true to the things that really mattered to Sam, such as Sam loved to be outside as much as he could be. He loved to listen to music. There was always music playing.
All right.
And he loved people. And so, again, speaking for my husband and myself, we are not extroverts, but we chose as our path, rather than the medications, therapy, religion, we chose to plant a garlic garden. Okay. We chose to listen to great music, and we chose to try to go up and introduce ourselves to people, talk to people we didn't know, right, and continue those sorts of reaching outs that Sam did.
Okay, and I suppose, it worked. I suppose. It helped you come to terms, I imagine, with Sam's passing.
It did, very much.
All right. Now, you mentioned something about gratitude, I believe, being grateful for things. How does practicing gratitude, how did it help you get a handle on this new normal?
When something like the death of a child, death of someone you love very much happens, or even, in sort of more mundane terms, things like somebody loses a job, or a tree falls on a house, things like that. It is so easy to fall into the pattern of everything is bad.
Okay.
And that, you're in the mood of, and the coffee's not hot enough, and the snow is on my car, and all those things that are so easy to complain about. And after Sam's death, it was really easy to just see everything as sad and bad and negative. And yet, in the midst of this incredible loss, we had the most wonderful people and animals and natural surroundings that gave us gifts every day. And for me, when I would take those minutes each day to think about the day and reflect upon it, and then for me, writing down what had happened that day for which I was grateful. And then I would post it online.
Right.
That act of thinking about it, writing it, and posting it was the only time in probably that first year at least, when my brain stopped its endless cycle of perseverating on the grief and the negatives. And for just a moment, as I did that, sort of the light would come back, and I would feel some peace, and I would feel the love that we were being shown. And in doing so, I realized how much it was helping me to realize that the world wasn't an awful, horrible place.
Okay. So, it occurs to me then that, I guess from what you say, that gratitude does have a psychological effect. It's not like putting a Band-Aid on a wound. It's sort of like working with it then.
Absolutely. And since then, as I traveled this path of what I refer to as conscious and deliberate gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
Over the last year in particular, I've been reading brain studies where they talk about how if people consistently practice a gratitude routine for 30 days, that it actually changes brain chemistry in a positive manner. And that in some of the early studies, it's showing as much benefit as some of the antidepressant medications.
Mm.
And
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
I didn't go into it thinking I'm going to change my brain chemistry.
Okay.
I went into it trying to survive.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the end, it did change my brain chemistry.
All right. So based on your experience then, this has an actual physiological effect as well as psychological one.
Yes, very much. Very much so. I know, sort of looking at me personally, my heart rate when I'm writing about my gratitude is very consistent according to my Fitbit as it is when I meditate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So practicing conscious and deliberate gratitude, this is not just psychological hoo-ha. I mean, this thing does have physical consequences. Interesting.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Cool. So, all right. What about now? About handling grief. I mean, community does play a part. I mean, I imagine that one of the reasons why people would involve themselves in religion, and getting into a gathering of people, and feeling a sense of community with that. Did this community play a part in dealing with grief?
I think it very much does. And I would say that I think our experience with community and grief was very different than that of many families who have lost a child to an opioid overdose.
All right. In what way?
With very few exceptions, our community embraced us, even though we were openly stating how Sam had died.
All right.
And that is unusual from talking to other families who have lost to overdose. We've heard frequently of people not wanting to hear about it or talk about it.
Right, right.
We also, though, Sam had such an incredible wealth of just the most amazing friends. And they were all 18 to 25 at the time he died. Mm-hmm. And their understanding of life and death and energy and the universe and all of those things is far beyond what mine is even now.
Okay.
And they came forward and wrapped around us and still wrap around us as a family with their parents, with all these different sort of combinations of people to show us how much to this day they love Sam, and in that love, how much they love us. And so going to hear Sam's favorite band perform 30 months after he died,
all right,
a whole bunch of his friends came with us to be there with us because they knew how emotional it would be for us.
All right.
And that sort of willingness and openness to admit the sort of that all of us continue to grieve has allowed us to be who we are without having to hide it.
All right. So support, what I'm getting here is that support and acceptance, this is what you got from your community.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So Kris, let me posit this question to you. Let's say you came across someone who's dealing with grief for whatever reason, and you only had enough time to tell that person one thing about how to handle or how to manage it. What would be that one thing you would tell them?
To remember the person that they've lost, and remember what it was that they loved most, and to find a way to celebrate that thing, event, hobby, whatever it is, for that person.
All right. All right. Great words. Great words. Okay. Got that. Got that. All right, Kris. So, in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any words of wisdom you'd like to share to maybe inspire listeners?
First thing I would say is if someone is grieving, that we all grieve differently.
Okay.
And don't let anyone tell you that unless you are self-harming or harming others, don't let anyone tell you your way is wrong. The second thing is all of us have incredible stories in our lives, and share your stories. And even if it's not that you want to publish books or articles or anything like that, find a way to record your stories, because it's a good way to learn about yourself.
All right. Right. Okay. All right. So, great words of wisdom right there. Okay, great. Okay, then. So, in closing, the book is Of Grief, Garlic, and Gratitude, Returning to Hope and Joy from a Shattered Life, Sam's Love Story. The author's our guest, Kris Franceour, and you can find her book on Amazon. So, Kris, thank you very much for being on AuthorStory. Thank you very much for being willing to share this, you know, this sad story with us, and putting yourself out there so that we can learn something from it.
Thank you so much for having me today. It was great to join you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So everyone, check out Of Grief, Garlic, and Gratitude, and also be sure to subscribe to our channel to check out all the awesome authors and great books we have already covered and which we will cover in the future. See you all next time on Author Story, where we speak to another inspiring author about another great book.